The heat wave didn't break. It just waited outside the sliding glass doors like a physical weight. Inside Metro General, the air conditioning hummed a losing battle against the humidity. In the center of the chaos, Grace Valdez stood perfectly still. While the residents shouted over a crashing monitor and the charge nurse barked orders, Grace's hands moved with a terrifying, silent precision. She wasn't just restocking a crash cart, she was prepping a weapon. Every vial, every syringe was aligned with obsessive symmetry, handles facing out, ready for a blind grab in the dark. She wore long sleeves under her scrubs, despite the sweltering temperature, to hide the burn scars that mapped her forearms. A news anchor on the waiting room TV droned on about a manhunt for AWOL Special Forces, but Grace didn't look up. She simply touched the hidden pocket inside her scrub top, her pulse steady, her eyes scanning the room not like a healer, but like a predator assessing a kill zone. She looked like a nurse. She stood like a soldier. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The heat had been suffocating the city for so long, the asphalt outside shimmered like a mirage. From the ground floor, the world was just flashes of ambulance lights through the haze. Inside, the corridor of Metro General stretched ahead, a tunnel of fluorescent glare and scuffed linoleum. Monitors beeped in uneven, frantic rhythms. Gurneys clattered. Phones rang somewhere out of sight. Grace Valdez stood at the supply station for one breath, then turned her back on the noise. The shift had begun. She checked the ID clipped to her scrub top. Grace Valdez, RN, Emergency Department. The plastic felt light, flimsy. It belonged to a woman who didn't exist. At the nurse's station, a resident slammed a chart down. A trauma pager buzzed angrily. The air carried the sharp, clean sting of iodine over something older, the metallic scent of dried blood that never quite washed out of a memory. Grace walked toward the trauma bay, rubber soles silent on the tile. She kept her pace even, shoulders rolled forward, chin down, the subordinate posture she had practiced in front of a bathroom mirror. Doctors passed her in a blur, arguing about labs. A porter rushed a wheelchair past her. No one paid her any attention. Good. Near the central desk, the attending physician leaned against the counter, scrolling through a tablet. He was young, ambitious, with hair styled perfectly despite the sweat on his brow. The name on his badge read, Alexander Sterling, MD. He didn't look up at first, only flicked his eyes sideways when Grace stopped a few feet away to check the vitals monitor. "You're the agency hire?" he said. His voice was clipped, impatient, the way someone speaks to a vending machine. "From where was it?" "The Midwest." "Rural transport," Grace lied. "South Dakota." One corner of his mouth twitched. "Right. Transport. Not exactly a level 1 trauma center." She let the comment sit. Silence was usually safer than explanation. He finally turned fully toward her. In the harsh light, he looked tired, already overwhelmed by the patient load. "Grace," he read from her badge as if testing the word. "Yes, doctor." His gaze swept over her, not lingering. He saw what most people saw, a quiet woman in standard issue blue scrubs, dark hair pulled back severely, blending into the beige walls. Nothing special. Beneath her long sleeves, hidden by fabric and shame, the jagged map of burn scars tightened against her skin. "Heavy load tonight," Sterling muttered. "Respiratory distress in Bay 4 is escalating," she said softly. "And the crushing injury in Bay 2 needs a surgical airway kit on standby." He tipped his chin, eyes narrowing a fraction. "Bay 2 is stable. Don't borrow trouble, nurse." "Just preparing, doctor." "We stack priorities according to vitals, not nurse intuition," he said. "You will handle the vitals and the paperwork. If I need an opinion, I'll ask a resident." "Understood." His tone hadn't raised in volume, but the rank was pulled. He turned back to his tablet. Grace stepped away. The hallway seemed louder now, the edges of things slightly sharper. The dismissal pulled at her attention even after she turned. "Don't borrow trouble." She slipped her hand into her pocket as she walked toward the linen closet. Inside the small, cramped room, the smell of bleach was overpowering. She reached past the stacks of sterile sheets to where she had tucked her personal bag. She didn't open it. She just pressed her hand against the canvas. Inside, wrapped in a sock, was a faded, blood-stained Velcro patch. "Pararescue. That others may live." Her thumb rested over the shape of the patch through the fabric until the memory of the extraction chopper thrummed in her ears. Then she pulled her hand back, adjusted her scrubs, and turned toward the door. The sound of the hospital folded around her again. The sirens outside, the buzz of the lights, the steady rhythmic beep of a heart monitor that sounded too much like a countdown. Grace walked back into the light. She wasn't Captain Valdez tonight. Tonight she was just the help. The double doors of the ambulance bay burst open, admitting a blast of humid night air and the frantic high-pitched shout of a paramedic. The noise shattered the fragile ecosystem of the ER, cutting through the low hum of conversation like a jagged piece of glass. Trauma 1. We have a male, mid-20s, blunt force trauma to the neck, the paramedic yelled, wrestling the gurney around the corner. He took a baseball bat to the throat. Airway is compromised. Sats are dropping fast, 82% and falling. Grace Valdez was moving before the announcement finished. She fell into step beside the gurney, her eyes instantly locking onto the patient. He was thrashing, his hands clawing at his throat in the universal sign of suffocation. His face was a terrifying shade of mottled gray, his lips turning the dark violet of hypoxia. Get him to the bay. Dr. Sterling shouted, jogging to catch up. He snapped on a pair of gloves, his movements jerky. I need a crash cart. Prepare for RSI. We need to intubate immediately. They slammed into the trauma bay. Grace locked the wheels with a swift kick. She moved to the head of the bed, her hands steady as she began cutting away the patient's shirt. Doctor, there's significant swelling around the larynx, she said, her voice low but cutting through the noise. Anatomy is distorted. You might not get the tube. Sterling ignored her. Push 20 of etomidate and 100 of sucks. I'm going in. The drugs hit the patient's system. The thrashing stopped as the paralysis took hold. Now the man was entirely dependent on them to breathe. Sterling leaned over the patient, tilting the head back. He inserted the laryngoscope blade, metal clicking against teeth. He squinted, sweat beading on his forehead immediately. I can't see the cords, he muttered. Suction. I need more suction. Grace handed him the suction catheter, but she watched the monitor. The rhythmic beeping was slowing down, dropping in pitch. Beep, beep, beep. Oxygen saturation hit 70%. Damn it, Sterling hissed. Give me a smaller blade. A Miller 3. Doctor, sats are at 65, Grace said. She wasn't looking at the monitor anymore. She was looking at the patient's neck. It was a ruin of hematoma and swelling. You can't intubate through that trauma. You need a surgical airway. I can get it. Sterling snapped, his voice cracking. He jammed the new blade into the man's mouth. Don't tell me how to do my job, nurse. I just need a clear view. The monitor began to wail, a continuous high-pitched alarm that signaled critical failure. The patient's heart rate plummeted. Bradycardia. He was dying on the table. Sterling froze. The blade was still in the patient's mouth, but the doctor's hands were shaking. He was staring at the blood pooling in the throat, paralyzed by the sudden realization that he had paralyzed a man he couldn't ventilate. The residents in the room looked from the monitor to the doctor, their eyes wide with panic. The room was drowning in inaction. Grace didn't think. The nurse vanished. The pararescue jumper took over. She stepped inside Sterling's guard, hip-checking the frozen doctor out of the way with enough force to make him stumble back against the supply cabinets. What are you? Sterling started. Grace ignored him. She didn't reach for the scalpel. The kit was too far away and they didn't have 30 seconds. Her hand flashed to the fore tray. She grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath needle and a 3 milliliter syringe. With her left hand, she stabilized the patient's larynx, her fingers digging into the swelling until she felt the subtle ridge of the cricothyroid membrane. It was barely palpable under the trauma, but her fingers remembered the geography from 100 drills in the desert. She detached the syringe from the needle. She didn't hesitate. She drove the heavy-gauge needle straight through the skin and into the trachea. She felt the give as the needle entered the airway. She aspirated the syringe, air bubbled back red and frothy. Verification. She pulled the needle out, leaving the plastic catheter in place, and instantly attached the ambubag adapter. Bag him, she ordered. It wasn't a suggestion. The respiratory therapist, stunned, squeezed the bag. The patient's chest rose. A collective exhale swept through the room, louder than the mechanical hiss of the oxygen. The wailing alarm on the monitor silenced as the heart rate began to climb. Beep beep, beep beep. The oxygen numbers ticked up. 50, 65, 80, 90. Grace taped the catheter down, her movements blurring with efficiency. Only then did she step back, wiping a speck of blood from her glove. She looked up. The room was dead silent. No one was moving. 4 nurses, 2 residents, and Dr. Sterling were staring at her. They weren't looking at her like she was a hero, they were looking at her like she was a stranger who had just spoken a foreign language. Sterling stood by the cabinets, his face pale, his ego bruised purple. He looked at the needle sticking out of the patient's throat, a jagged, field-expedient procedure that no civilian nurse was trained to perform, let alone execute in under 5 seconds. You. Sterling's voice was barely a whisper. He straightened his coat, trying to regain the authority that had just evaporated. You just performed an invasive surgical procedure without a license. Do you have any idea what you've just done? Grace stripped off her gloves, her face returning to a mask of blank neutrality. But as she turned to the sink, she saw the charge nurse picking up the phone, her eyes locked on Grace with a mixture of awe and accusation. And through the glass doors of the trauma bay, standing near the triage desk, a man in a dark suit turned his head sharply toward the commotion, his gaze drilling straight through the chaos to land squarely on her. The air in the nursing director's office was stagnant, smelling of stale coffee and bureaucratic dread. It was a sharp departure from the copper tang of blood in the trauma bay, but the threat here felt just as lethal. Grace sat in a low vinyl chair that seemed designed to make the occupant feel small. Across the desk, Director Reynolds pursed her lips, tapping a pen against a stack of incident forms. Dr. Sterling paced the small room like a caged animal, his pristine white coat now wrinkled, a physical manifestation of his rattled nerves. It was a field modification, Grace said. Her voice was steady, monotone. She stared at a water stain on the ceiling tile, refusing to make eye contact. The patient had total airway obstruction. The standard algorithm failed. The algorithm didn't fail because we didn't finish the algorithm. Sterling snapped, spinning to face her. His face was flushed. I was switching to a Miller blade. I had it under control. Instead, you shoved a 14-gauge needle into a man's throat like we were in a war zone. He had 30 seconds, doctor, Grace said, shifting her gaze to him. The intensity in her eyes made him flinch. You spent 45 looking for suction. Enough, Reynolds cut in, her voice sharp. She dropped the pen. Grace, we aren't debating the patient's survival. He's alive. But you operated outside your scope of practice. Way outside. You humiliated an attending physician and exposed this hospital to a massive liability lawsuit. I saved his life, Grace countered, though she knew the argument was pointless. In the civilian world, procedure outweighed survival. You acted like a cowboy, Sterling muttered, crossing his arms. We don't need cowboys. We need nurses who follow orders. Reynolds sighed, rubbing her temples. This is a serious breach, Grace. Cowboy antics don't fly here. I'm placing you on administrative leave effectively immediately, pending a board review. Honestly, you should prepare yourself for termination. And a report to the licensing board. Grace felt a strange, cold calm wash over her. Termination. Investigation. Paperwork. Background checks. If they dug into her background to revoke her license, they wouldn't find a nursing degree from South Dakota. They would find gaps. They would find redacted files. They would find the ghost of a dead woman. I understand, Grace said. She stood up. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She simply turned for the door. We aren't finished, Reynolds called out, startled by the sudden acquiescence. I am, Grace said softly. She walked out of the office and into the corridor. Her heart wasn't racing from the reprimand. It was racing from the escape plan already formulating in her mind. She had a go bag in her car. She had $3,000 in cash in a hollowed-out textbook in her apartment. She could be in Oregon by morning. She moved quickly toward the employee lockers, keeping her head down. The hospital, once a sanctuary of anonymity, now felt like a trap. Every security camera felt like an eye, every intercom chime like an alert. Burn the cover, her instinct screamed. No. She reached the lobby, intending to exit through the main revolving doors to the parking garage. The atrium was crowded with visitors seeking shelter from the heat wave, the air thick with humidity and noise. Grace wove through the crowd, her hand gripping the strap of her bag. She was 10 feet from the exit when she froze. Near the security desk, a man in a dark suit was leaning over the counter. It was the man she had seen earlier. Up close, the federal cut of his jacket was unmistakable, concealing the weapon at his hip. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was showing something to the security guard, a laminated card. Grace stepped behind a large potted fern, her breath catching in her throat. She focused on the card in the agent's hand. It wasn't a photo of Nurse Grace. It was an old military ID. The woman in the photo had short, cropped hair and a look of defiance that the current Grace had spent years trying to erase. And the name printed below the face wasn't Grace Valdez. The security guard squinted at the ID, then shook his head, pointing vaguely toward the elevators. The agent nodded, took the ID back, and turned. For a split second, Agent Nathan Cross looked directly at the fern where Grace was hiding. His eyes were scanning, methodical, hunting. He didn't see her, not yet, but he began walking with purpose toward the elevators that led to the administration floor she had just left. Grace pressed her back against the cool wall, her pulse thundering in her ears like a drumbeat. He wasn't just looking for a deserter. He knew exactly who she was, and he had just sealed off her only exit. Grace didn't take the elevator. Elevators were metal coffins that trapped you between floors while security waited in the lobby. Instead, she slipped through a service door near the cafeteria, trading the sterile chill of the hallway for the humid, cabbage-scented air of the kitchen corridor. She moved with a fluidity that belonged to a different life. Her rubber-soled shoes made no sound on the grease-stained concrete. She bypassed the laundry chutes and headed for the loading dock at the rear of the building. It was the exit used by linen trucks and waste disposal, unguarded, unglamorous, and her only way out. Her hand was already in her pocket, gripping her car keys like a shiv. Get to the Civic. Drive south. Ditch the car in Tacoma. Bus to Portland. The plan assembled itself in her mind with the cold logic of a tactical briefing. She pushed against the heavy crash bar of the rear exit. The door swung open, revealing the twilight heat of the loading bay. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and dumpster rot. Grace stepped out, her eyes immediately sweeping the perimeter. Clear left. Clear right. You always did check your corners first, a voice said from the shadows behind a stack of blue shipping pallets. Grace spun, dropping her center of gravity, her body coiled to strike. Agent Nathan Cross stepped into the pool of yellow light cast by the security flood lamp. He held his hands up, palms open, waist high. A gesture of surrender or a warning. He wasn't reaching for the Glock holstered at his hip. Don't run, Grace, he said. His voice was rough, tired. I'm not in the mood to chase a PJ across a parking lot. I know I'd lose. I don't know who you are, Grace lied, her voice flat. She shifted her weight, calculating the distance between them. 12 feet. Too far to rush him before he could draw. You're confusing me with someone else. Captain Grace Valdez. Service number 784-99-221. USAF Pararescue, Cross recited, stepping closer. He ignored the lethal tension radiating off her. Reported MIA, then AWOL after Operation Pale Horse. Syria. 2 years ago. The name of the operation hit her like a physical blow. The air in her lungs turned to glass. I'm just a nurse, she said, though the lie tasted like ash. Step aside. I can't do that. Cross stopped 10 feet away. He looked older than his ID photo. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and cheap whiskey. I'm not here to arrest you, Captain. I'm here because you're the only other person who knows the truth. Grace laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. The truth? The truth is I deserted. That's what the file says. That's what he wrote. I know what Colonel Vance wrote, Cross interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. I read the report. It said your unit was overrun. It said you panicked and broke radio silence. It said you were the reason the extraction failed. Grace flinched. The memory clawed at her, the dust, the screaming, the radio static. If you know the report, then you know I'm dangerous. Walk away. I know the report is a lie, Cross said. He lowered his hands slowly. Because I was driving the bus. Grace froze. She stared at him, really looking at him for the first time. The set of his jaw. The way he stood. Angel 04, Cross whispered. That was my call sign. I was the pilot of the extraction chopper. I was hovering 2 clicks out, waiting for the green light. The silence on the loading dock was deafening. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. She remembered the sound of rotors in the distance, the sound that never came closer. You. She choked on the word. You left us. I was ordered to abort, Cross said, the pain in his voice raw and undeniable. Vance called it in. He said the LZ was too hot. He said there were no survivors to pick up. I screamed at him on the comms. I told him I had thermal signatures. I told him you were still fighting. He took a step forward, his eyes pleading. He ordered me to turn back. He threatened a court-martial if I crossed that line. Grace's hands, still clenched into fists, began to tremble. Why are you here? Because Vance is up for a promotion, Cross hissed. Pentagon Chief of Staff. If he gets that star, the file on Pale Horse gets buried forever. I've been building a case for 18 months. I have flight logs, comms recordings. But I need a witness. I need the soldier he left behind to die. He reached into his jacket pocket. Grace tensed, but he only pulled out a manila envelope. I don't want to put you in cuffs, Grace. I want to put you on the stand. Grace looked at the envelope, then back at the hospital door. The safety of her anonymity was shattered. If I testify, she whispered, I go to prison anyway. Desertion is still desertion. Not if we prove he abandoned you first, Cross said. Help me nail him. Help me clear the names of the men we lost. Grace stared at the concrete. The ghosts of her squad were suddenly crowding the loading dock, waiting for her answer. She opened her mouth to speak, to tell him to go to hell, to tell him it was too late. But before the words could form, the heavy security light above them buzzed angrily. It flared bright white once, twice, and then died. The hum of the massive HVAC units on the roof sputtered and groaned into silence. Sudden, absolute darkness swallowed the loading dock. Inside the hospital, the muffled sounds of machinery halted, replaced by the terrifying, distinctive silence of a power grid failing. What the hell? Cross muttered, reaching for his flashlight. Grace didn't need a flashlight. She looked toward the hospital windows. They were black. All of them. The backup generators, she said, her voice tightening. They should have kicked in by now. Maybe a delay? Cross suggested, clicking his light on. The beam cut through the humid air. No, Grace said, her nurse's training colliding with her tactical instincts. In a level 1 trauma center, the transfer is instant. If the lights are out. She turned back to the door, the envelope forgotten. Then the ventilators are off. The darkness wasn't empty, it was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against the eardrums. For 3 seconds, the world hung in a suspended state of shock. Then the silence was shattered not by the roar of backup generators, but by the terrifying absence of them. The grid, Cross said, clicking his flashlight off and on, aiming it at the towering HVAC units on the roof. They remained dead iron giants against a starless sky. The whole block is down. Look at the skyline. Grace didn't look at the skyline. She was already moving. They aren't kicking in, she said, her voice dropping into a register that wasn't Nurse Grace anymore. It was Captain Valdez. The transfer switches failed. We have maybe 2 minutes before the battery backups on the life support monitors die. The ventilators stopped instantly. She slammed her shoulder into the loading dock door, bursting back into the kitchen corridor. The emergency lights, faint, battery-operated bug eyes mounted on the walls, flickered weakly, casting long, sickly yellow shadows down the hallway. Grace, wait. Cross yelled, his footsteps pounding behind her. You can't go back in there. If the grid is blown, this is a federal issue. We need to evacuate. You evacuate, she threw back over her shoulder, not breaking stride. I have 7 patients on mechanical ventilation in the ICU and 3 in the ER. They just stopped breathing. If I leave, they're dead in 4 minutes. They burst through the double doors into the main ER, and the scene was straight out of a nightmare. The emergency department, usually a place of controlled chaos, had dissolved into a blind panic. The only light came from the frantic strobe effect of cell phone flashlights cutting through the gloom. The air was already growing hotter, the smell of antiseptic mixing with the sharp scent of fear sweat. Help. I can't see, a resident screamed from Bay 3. Where is the attending? My patient is seizing. The sounds were magnified in the dark. The crash of a metal tray. The thud of a body hitting the floor. But underneath the human noise was the silence that terrified Grace the most. The cessation of the rhythmic whoosh of the ventilators. Grace navigated the darkness by memory. She knew exactly where the crash cart in Trauma 1 sat. She knew the distance to the nurse's station in steps. She dodged a gurney that had been abandoned in the middle of the aisle, grabbed a flashlight from the counter and clicked it on. The beam cut a harsh white tunnel through the dust motes. It landed on Dr. Sterling. The attending physician was standing in the center of the room, spinning in a slow circle, holding his phone up like a talisman. He looked small. Without the monitors, without the labs, without the humming machinery of modern medicine, he was paralyzed. Dr. Sterling. Grace barked. He jumped, shielding his eyes from her light. The power? The generators didn't. Forget the generators, Grace ordered, closing the distance. Bay 2, Bay 4, and Trauma 1. Who is bagging them? I don't. Who is bagging them? She roared. Somewhere to their left, the muffled sound of pounding came from the elevator shaft. A hollow, metallic banging of fists against steel doors. The surgeons, a terrified nurse whispered from the darkness. Dr. Brooks and the trauma team, they were taking the gunshot wound up to the OR. They're stuck between floors. Grace swung her light toward the elevator doors. The red digital floor indicator was dead. The trauma team was trapped in a steel box with a bleeding patient, suspended in the dark. Okay, Grace said. The word was soft, but it carried. The panic in her chest was gone, replaced by the cold, crystalline focus of the drop zone. This wasn't a hospital anymore. It was a mass casualty event in a hostile environment. She turned to Cross, who was standing at the periphery, his hand on his weapon, eyes scanning for a threat he could shoot. "You looked lost, Cross," she said. He snapped his head toward her. "You said you wanted to help?" She didn't wait for an answer. She shone her light onto the nearest crash cart. "I need you to break the glass on the airway drawer. Grab every ambibag you can find. We have to manually ventilate every intubated patient. Now." "On it," Cross said, holstering his gun and grabbing the cart. Grace climbed onto the central desk, her flashlight beam sweeping over the terrified faces of the staff huddled in the shadows. They were waiting to die. They needed to be told how to survive. "Listen to me." Her voice projected from the diaphragm, commanding the room. The screaming subsided into whimpers. "We are in a mass casualty protocol. The equipment is dead. We are the equipment now." She scanned the room, identifying the threats. The heat was rising. The electronic locks on the drug cabinets would be frozen. The blood bank refrigerators were warming up. But as she swept her light toward the back of the ear, the beam caught something that made her blood run cold. The automatic sliding doors to the ambulance bay had been pry-barred open. Standing in the rain and the dark, silhouetted against the dead skyline, were three figures. They weren't paramedics. They were wearing heavy coats, despite the heat, and they were moving toward the pharmacy with a purpose that had nothing to do with saving lives. Grace clicked her light off instantly, plunging herself back into the safety of the dark. She dropped from the desk, landing silently beside Cross. "Change of plans?" she whispered, grabbing his arm. "We aren't just fighting the dark. We have looters in the wire." "Cross, you have the pharmacy," Grace whispered, her voice a rush of cold air in the stifling heat. "If they get the narcotics, this hospital turns into a war zone. Hold the line." Agent Cross hesitated only a fraction of a second. He looked at the shadows moving near the drug dispensary, then back at Grace. He nodded once, drawing his weapon, and melted into the darkness toward the threat. Grace turned her back on the looters. Her war was here among the gurneys. The ER had dissolved into a frantic, aimless scuffle. Without the hum of the ventilation system, the silence was punctuated only by the terrifying gasps of patients waking up into suffocation. "Dr. Sterling," a resident screamed, waving a cell phone light over a bed. "Bed 4 is bradying down. I can't feel a pulse. What do I do?" Grace swept her flashlight beam toward the center of the room. Dr. Sterling was standing over the crash cart, frantically punching buttons on a defibrillator that was as dead as a brick. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting around for a monitor, a screen, a readout, anything to tell him what was happening. He was a creature of modern medicine, and without his digital eyes he was blind. "Doctor," the resident pleaded. I can't." Sterling stammered, his hands shaking so hard he dropped a stethoscope. "I don't know the rhythm. I can't treat what I can't see." Grace watched him crumble. The hierarchy of the hospital was dissolving. If she stayed Nurse Grace for 10 more seconds, 12 people would die. The heat was becoming unbearable. The long-sleeved thermal undershirt she wore to hide her history felt like a straitjacket, clinging to her skin, restricting her range of motion. "Burn the cover," the voice in her head commanded. "Save the squad." She didn't unbutton her scrub top. She grabbed the collar of the undershirt beneath it and pulled. The fabric tore with a sharp riot that cut through the whimpering in the room. She yanked the sleeves down, stripping the garment off her arms and tossing it onto the floor. The beam of a passing flashlight caught her. For 2 years, Grace had hidden her arms. Now the light traced the jagged, shiny keloid scars that spiraled up her forearms, burns from the burning fuselage of a Pavehawk helicopter. They weren't just injuries, they were a map of hell. She didn't look at the scars. She vaulted onto the central nurse's station desk, her boots slamming onto the laminate with a thud that vibrated through the floor. "Lights on me," she bellowed. It wasn't a shout. It was a command voice, diaphragm deep, projected, the kind of voice designed to cut through rotor wash and gunfire. Startled, 5 or 6 beams of light swung toward her. She stood illuminated in the center of the chaos, scarred arms crossed, looking not like a subordinate but like a titan. "Sterling, stand down," she ordered. She didn't look at him, but he froze, shocked into obedience. Everyone listen to me. We are running manual ventilation protocols. If you have hands, you are working. The panic in the room suspended, replaced by the sudden shock of a new authority. You, she pointed a sharp finger at the terrified resident. Grab the ambu bag for bed 4. 1 breath every 6 seconds. Count it out loud. 1,000 to 1,000. Go. The resident moved instantly. Nurse Miller, take the trauma bay, Grace barked, pivoting. You have 3 patients. Organize a rotation. 2 minutes on the bag, 2 minutes off. Anyone who gets tired, swap out. Do not stop squeezing. But, who are you? A medical student stammered, staring up at her. I am the person keeping you alive, Grace said, her eyes hard. Now move. Supplies. I need every flashlight pooled at the central desk. I need the O2 tanks from the ambulances brought inside. We are operating on manual pressure. She spotted Sterling still standing by the crash cart, looking like a ghost. Sterling, she snapped. He looked up, eyes wide. You're a surgeon, she said, her voice dropping the aggression but keeping the steel. You don't need a monitor to feel a femoral pulse. Go to bed too. He's bleeding internally. Use your hands. Sterling blinked, the fog of panic clearing just enough for his training to kick in. He looked at her, then at the patient. He nodded, swallowed hard, and ran to the bedside. The room shifted. The chaotic noise organized into a rhythm. Squeeze, release, squeeze, release. The counting of seconds replaced the screaming. Grace hopped down from the desk, her boots hitting the floor with purpose. She moved through the dark like a shark, correcting a nurse's grip on a bag, adjusting a patient's head position, checking tourniquets by feel. She was entirely in her element. The hospital had died, but the battlefield was alive. She reached the far end of the ER, wiping sweat from her brow, feeling the adrenaline hum in her veins. She had stabilized the room. They could hold this for an hour, maybe 2. Then a heavy, metallic clang echoed from the elevator shaft behind her. Grace spun around, shining her light on the steel doors. They were dented from the inside. Help us! A muffled voice screamed from within the shaft. It was Dr. Brooks. The cable? I think the brake is slipping. We're falling. Grace pressed her ear against the cold metal door. She heard the groaning of stressed steel and the terrified sobbing of the trauma team trapped in the dark between the 3rd and 4th floors. And then, terrifyingly, she heard the distinct, snapping sound of a cable fraying strand by strand. The emergency room had ceased to be a place of healing. It was now a forward operating base. The darkness stripped away the sterile politeness of civilian medicine, leaving only the brutal arithmetic of survival. Grace didn't run, she patrolled. Her boots crunched over broken glass as she moved from bay to bay, her flashlight cutting sharp arcs through the humid, stagnant air. The scars on her exposed arms glistened with sweat, no longer hidden, no longer shameful. They were badges of authority that the terrified residents instinctively obeyed. We're out of occlusive dressings, a nurse shouted from the trauma bay, pressing a gauze pad against a patient's chest. The sucking chest wound in bay 3, the seal isn't holding. Grace didn't hesitate. Go to the cafeteria. Kitchen storage, she barked at a hovering orderly. Bring me every roll of plastic wrap you can find. And get the duct tape from the maintenance closet on the way back. Move. The orderly blinked, confused. Plastic wrap is airtight, Grace snapped, her voice leaving no room for debate. It makes a 3-sided chest seal. Go. He ran. Grace turned her attention to the triage desk. She had organized the walking wounded into a bucket brigade, passing saline bags down the line. But the perimeter was the problem. The automatic doors were pry-barred open, a gaping mouth inviting the chaos of the blackened city inside. Movement flickered in the shadows near the ambulance bay. Grace swung her light, ready to fight, but the beam caught the silhouette of a man dragging a heavy metal bench across the threshold. It was Cross. He slammed the bench against the sliding doors, wedging it into the frame to create a barricade. He was breathing hard, his suit jacket gone, his white shirt rolled up to the elbows and stained with soot. He tested the barricade with a shove, then turned and walked toward her. Pharmacy is secure, Cross said, his voice grim. Had to convince a few locals that the narcotics locker wasn't worth the bullet. They scattered. He stopped in front of her, his eyes tracking the way she directed the room. He looked at her arms, then up to her face. There was no trace of the agent hunting a fugitive left in his posture. He stood at ease, waiting. What's the sit rep, Captain? He asked quietly. Grace felt a jolt at the title, but she didn't reject it. We're stabilizing. But we're bleeding resources. I have 3 critical patients who need transport to the surgical floor, but the elevators are death traps. I can move them, Cross said. He looked around, assessing the panicked staff. These kids are scared. They need a heavy lifter. You point, I carry. Take bed 6, Grace ordered, pointing to a large man with a compound fracture. We need him moved to the hallway. It's cooler there and I need this bay for the overflow. Done. Cross moved with the efficiency of a soldier. He didn't ask for a gurney. He organized 2 residents, counted down a lift, and physically hauled the mattress and patient with a strength that spoke of his own field time. He became her shadow, her enforcer. When a frantic family member tried to rush the triage line, Cross was there, a solid wall of calm authority, guiding them back without drawing his weapon. The orderly returned, breathless, clutching 3 industrial rolls of saran wrap and a roll of silver duct tape. Good, Grace said. She grabbed the supplies and knelt beside the chest wound patient. With swift, violent efficiency, she ripped a square of plastic, taped it over the bubbling wound on 3 sides, and watched as the patient's breathing instantly eased. Field medicine, Cross noted, appearing beside her with a fresh oxygen tank he'd scavenged from an ambulance. It works, Grace muttered, taping the final edge. It's ugly, but it works. You haven't lost a step, Valdez, he said low enough that only she could hear. You're running this floor better than Vance ever ran the ops center. Grace stiffened, the praise hitting a raw nerve. She stood up, wiping blood on her scrubs. We aren't out of this yet. The batteries on the portable monitors are going to die in 10 minutes. Then we're flying completely blind. As if on cue, the muffled screaming from the elevator shaft intensified. The banging against the steel doors echoed through the ER like a hammer against a hull. Grace spun toward the sound. She had stabilized the floor. She had secured the perimeter. But the hardest decision was waiting behind those dented doors. Cross, she said, her voice tight. Grab the crowbar from the maintenance pile. I need you at the elevator. We getting them out? Cross asked, hefting the heavy iron bar. We have to, Grace said, walking toward the shaft, her flashlight beam trembling slightly in her hand. Because Dr. Brooks isn't just stuck. I can hear the patient monitor through the door. She paused, looking back at him with haunted eyes. The patient on that elevator is bleeding out. And if we don't open those doors, Dr. Sterling is going to have to do something he's never done before. What's that? Surgery, Grace said, staring at the dark metal seam. In the dark. Without an operating room. The metal screeched, a sound like a dying animal, as Cross threw his entire weight against the crowbar. The elevator doors fought back, then groaned and gave way, sliding open to reveal a gap of waist-high darkness. The car was stuck 3 feet below the floor level. Inside, the scene was a tableau of desperation. Dr. Brooks was on her knees in a pool of dark liquid, her hands pressed deep into the abdomen of the patient on the stretcher. He's distended. Brooks yelled up at them, her face smeared with sweat and grime. Rigid abdomen. BP is non-existent. Something burst. Pass him up, Grace ordered. It took all 3 of them, Cross hauling from the shoulders, Grace on the belt, and Brooks pushing from below, to drag the unconscious man onto the corridor floor. He was pale, waxy, already ghost-like in the beam of the flashlights. We need to get him to the OR, Sterling stammered, checking for a pulse that wasn't there. Stairwells, we can carry him up 4 flights. He has 2 minutes, not 10, Grace said, kneeling beside the body. She pressed her hand to the man's stomach. It was hard as rock. Massive internal hemorrhage. He bleeds out before we hit the 2nd floor. She looked up at Sterling. The young surgeon was shaking, his eyes darting to the dark stairwell. We open him here, Grace said. Sterling recoiled. Here? On the floor? In the dark? That's insanity. It's malpractice. It's murder. It's triage, Grace snapped. She grabbed a sterile surgical tray from the supply pile Cross had scavenged. She ripped the plastic packaging with her teeth, dumping a scalpel, retractors, and clamps onto a draped towel. Cross, I need high beams on the abdomen. Don't waver. On it. Cross knelt at the patient's head, clicking 2 heavy-duty mag lights on and aiming them directly at the man's stomach. The circle of light was blindingly bright against the surrounding gloom. Grace shoved the scalpel handle into Sterling's hand. He held it like it was a live grenade. I can't see the landmarks, Sterling whispered, panic seizing his throat. The shadows are all wrong. I'll nick the aorta. I can't. Look at me, Grace said. She didn't shout. She dropped her voice to that terrifyingly calm register. the voice that had talked rookies through amputations in the back of a vibrating helicopter. She reached out and gripped Sterling's forearm. Her grip was iron. "Breathe," she commanded. "In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Sterling stared at her. He saw the scars on her arms, the blood on her scrubs, and the absolute, unwavering certainty in her eyes. He took a breath. "You know the anatomy, Doctor," Grace said, her voice a metronome of focus. "The darkness doesn't change where the spleen is. Trust your hands." She guided his hand toward the patient's sternum. "Midline incision," she instructed. "Xiphoid to pubis. 1 clean line. Do it." Sterling swallowed hard. The tip of the blade touched the skin. He pressed down. "Go," Grace said. He cut. Blood welled up, black in the flashlight beam, but Grace was already there with a wad of lap pads, soaking it up, keeping the field visual. "Retractors," she barked, handing them to a stunned resident who had appeared in the doorway. "Pull. Hard." The abdomen fell open. The cavity was full of blood. "I can't see the source," Sterling yelled, his panic spiking again as the blood pooled faster than they could sponge it. "There's too much." "Don't chase the blood," Grace said, her voice right at his ear, cutting through the noise. "Pack the quadrants. Upper left first. Isolate the spleen." She moved his hands for him, not doing the surgery but choreographing it. She shoved Grace packs into the void. "Feel it," she urged. "Feel the hilum. Is it ruptured?" Sterling dug his hands into the warm slickness. He closed his eyes for a split second, shutting out the shadows, letting his fingers see. "Yes," he gasped. "Splenic rupture. It's shattered." "Clamp the pedicle," Grace ordered. She slapped a vascular clamp into his palm. "Blind feel. You know the shape. Find the stalk. Clamp it down." Sterling's hand trembled. The patient gasped, a jagged, agonal breath. "Steady," Grace whispered. "Smooth is fast. Fast is smooth. Clamp." Sterling reached deep. He maneuvered the metal instrument. He felt the pulse of the artery against his fingertip. He squeezed. Click. The flow of blood stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Sterling pulled his hands back, staring at the clamp sitting perfectly on the vessel. He looked up at Grace, his eyes wide, sweat dripping from his nose. He looked like a man who had just walked through fire and survived. "Suction," he rasped, his voice trembling but his own. Let's clean this up." Grace nodded, stepping back into the shadows as the residents rushed in to assist. She wiped her hands on her pants, her heart rate finally beginning to decel. She looked over at Cross. The agent was still holding the light steady, but he wasn't looking at the patient. He was looking at her. He had watched the entire performance. The command, the tactical precision, the way she had turned a panicked boy into a surgeon. Grace met his gaze. There was no point in hiding it anymore. The nurse was gone. But before Cross could speak, a mechanical thrum vibrated through the floorboards. A low, growing roar that started in the basement and rushed up through the walls. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, and then with a blinding snap, the power returned. The hallway flooded with harsh, artificial white light. It exposed everything: the blood on the floor, the tear in Grace's shirt, the jagged scars on her arms, and the stunned faces of 20 staff members who were staring at Nurse Grace as if she had just fallen from the sky. Sterling blinked in the sudden brightness, looking up from the patient. He opened his mouth to thank her, but his eyes drifted past her shoulder toward the lobby. "Grace," he whispered, his face draining of color. Grace turned. Standing at the end of the hallway, flanked by 2 uniformed police officers, was the hospital administrator. And beside him, looking smug and untouched by the night's chaos, stood a man in a pristine Air Force dress uniform. Colonel Vance had arrived. And he wasn't looking at the patient. He was looking straight at his missing captain. The return of the light didn't bring relief, it brought exposure. The fluorescent glare was harsh, reflecting off the pools of blood, the discarded wrappers of sterile equipment, and the sweat-streaked faces of the staff. For a moment the ER held its breath. The silence of the blackout was replaced by the sudden, discordant symphony of technology waking up. Monitors beeped in rapid succession, ventilators hissed back to life, and the hum of the cooling systems began to chase away the suffocating heat. Grace stood in the center of the hallway, her chest heaving. The adrenaline that had sustained her for the last hour began to recede, leaving her limbs heavy and her senses raw. She looked down at her hands. They were steady, but covered in the evidence of the surgery she had just orchestrated on a linoleum floor. "Vitals?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. Stable, a resident whispered, staring at the monitor that had just flickered on above the patient Dr. Sterling had operated on. BP is rising. Saturation is 98%. He made it. At the far end of the corridor, the group that had just arrived, the hospital administrator, the chief of nursing, and the uniformed military officer, began to move forward. They didn't storm in. They walked slowly, their eyes widening as they took in the scene. They expected to walk into a morgue. They expected to see bodies covered in sheets, the result of a catastrophic power failure in a level 1 trauma center. Instead, they saw the impossible. They passed Bay 3, where the sucking chest wound was sealed with cafeteria plastic wrap and duct tape, the patient breathing comfortably. They passed the triage line, where residents were methodically checking patients who had been manually ventilated by a rotation of medical students and janitorial staff. They saw the whiteboard at the nursing station, covered not in standard codes, but in tactical grid assignments, written in Grace's sharp, angular handwriting. It wasn't a hospital anymore. It was a field hospital. It was ugly, improvised, and utterly brilliant. The administrator, a man named Henderson who usually cared more about billing codes than patient care, stopped near the central desk. He looked at the chaos, the ripped supply boxes, the commandeered oxygen tanks, and then he looked at the monitors. Green lines. Rhythmic beeps. What happened here? Henderson asked, his voice hushed. Who was in charge? Dr. Sterling stepped forward. He looked like a wreck. His white coat was ruined, stained with the blood of the splenectomy patient. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of grime. He looked from Henderson to the military officer, then finally to Grace. Grace was already stepping back, her shoulders hunching forward, trying to shrink back into the persona of Nurse Grace. She reached for the sleeves of her torn undershirt, trying to cover the scars that were now visible to everyone. I take full responsibility, Sterling said. His voice was firm, lacking the arrogance that had defined him just hours ago. The protocols failed. The generator failed. We improvised. Henderson pointed to the surgical tray on the floor. You performed open abdominal surgery in a hallway, doctor. Do you have any idea the liability? The patient is alive. Sterling cut him off. He turned to look at the man on the floor, then back at the administration. They're all alive. Every single one of them. We didn't lose a soul in the dark. The silence stretched thin. Sterling walked past his boss, ignoring the hierarchy he had worshipped his entire career, and stopped in front of Grace. He looked at the needle decompression kit still taped to the wall. He looked at the way the staff was still looking at her, not for permission to leave but for the order to stand down. He realized that for the last 60 minutes, he hadn't been the attending. He had been a resident again, learning from a master. He saw the scars on her arms. He saw the unit patch she had shoved into her pocket earlier, the edge of it just visible. The pieces clicked into place. The skills, the calm, the way she moved. I told you not to borrow trouble, Sterling said quietly. I didn't, Grace replied, her eyes guarding her secrets. Trouble found us. Sterling shook his head slowly. He extended a hand, not a handshake of colleagues but a gesture of deference. Thank you, he said. The words were heavy with humility. We would have lost them. I would have lost him. You saved this hospital, Captain Valdez. The title hung in the air, louder than the returning alarms. The nurses within earshot froze. Grace didn't take his hand. She stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. The name was out. The cover was burned. She looked past Sterling to the end of the hall. Agent Cross was standing there, his face unreadable. But behind him, the colonel in the dress uniform stepped forward, a thin, predatory smile curling his lips as he heard the rank spoken aloud. He began a slow, deliberate clap that echoed chillingly against the tile walls. The heat wave was a distant memory, replaced by the biting chill of a November morning. The rain in Seattle didn't wash things clean, it just made everything heavier. But as Grace Valdez stepped out of her car, the weight she felt wasn't the burden of a secret. It was the solid, grounding weight of responsibility. She walked toward the coffee shop across the street from Metro General, her breath clouding in the cold air. She wasn't wearing the nondescript blue scrubs of a staff nurse anymore. She wore a slate-gray tactical fleece over surgical greens. The embroidery on the left breast didn't say, Nurse Grace. It read, G. Valdez, RNEMTP, Head of Disaster Medicine. Inside the cafe, the air smelled of roasted beans and damp wool. Nathan Cross was waiting at a corner table, nursing a black coffee. He looked better, less like a man haunting a graveyard, more like a man who had finally buried his ghosts. "You're late," Cross said, though he smiled as she approached. "Administrative meeting," Grace replied, sliding into the seat opposite him. She placed her own cup down, black, no sugar. "Board of Directors wanted to discuss the budget for the new rapid response training protocols. They're still nervous about the cost. Tell them it's cheaper than a lawsuit." Cross slid a thick file folder across the table. "Or tell them the FBI is subsidizing the program. That usually shuts them up." Grace rested her hand on the folder. The Joint Task Force, stamped on the cover, was real. 6 months ago, Colonel Vance had tried to bury her. Instead, with Cross's evidence and the testimony of 22 hospital staff members who watched her perform miracles in the dark, the inquiry had turned into a coronation. Vance was currently facing a congressional hearing, and Grace had been given a choice: discharge with honors or a new kind of service. She chose the hospital, but on her terms. "How is the team looking?" Cross asked. "Sterling is shaping up," Grace admitted. "He stopped looking for glory and started looking for bleeders. He's my second in command for the triage unit. He's actually teaching the interns how to suture by feel." "And the scars?" Cross asked, his eyes dropping briefly to her wrists. Grace didn't pull her sleeves down. She turned her arm over, looking at the keloid tracks that marked her history. They were still there, jagged and ugly, but she no longer felt the need to apologize for them. They were proof of survival. "They're just skin," she said. "The staff knows. The patients don't care. As long as my hands are steady." She checked her watch. "I have rounds in 10 minutes. We're running a mass casualty drill with the fire department at noon." "About that," Cross said, his tone shifting. The casual friend dropped away. The agent returned. He tapped the file folder. "This isn't just a budget approval. It's an activation order." Grace froze, her hand hovering over her coffee. "I thought we had a month before the next rotation." "We did," Cross said low. "But chatter is picking up. The agency picked up signals of a coordinated biological threat. Same signature as the Pale Horse Op. We think the supplier Vance was protecting is back in play." Grace stared at him. The noise of the coffee shop faded. The mission hadn't ended in the desert. It had just followed her home. "I'm listening," she said. "We need a medical lead who knows the symptoms," Cross said. "Someone who's seen it before. Someone who can run a containment zone in a civilian center without causing a panic." Grace stood up. She picked up the file, tucking it under her arm. She looked out the window at the hospital, the glass tower standing gray and imposing against the rain. It wasn't a hiding place anymore. It was a fortress, and she was the gatekeeper. "Walk with me," she said. They crossed the street together, moving with a synchronized stride. As they entered the sliding glass doors of the ER, the atmosphere shifted. The chaotic noise of the waiting room didn't grate on her nerves. It registered as data. Triage line moving slow. Infant crying in corner. Fever. Security alert at the north entrance. She walked past the reception desk. The security guard, the same one who had once looked at her ID with suspicion, straightened up and nodded. "Morning, Captain." "Morning," Grace replied. She didn't correct him. She pushed through the double doors into the trauma bay. The staff looked up. Residents, nurses, attending physicians. They didn't look through her anymore. They looked to her. Grace walked to the central station, throwing the file down on the desk. She scanned the board, her board. "Dr. Sterling," she called out. "Yes, Chief." Sterling answered from Bay 2, snapping his head up. "Clear the board," Grace said, her voice dropping into that familiar, terrifyingly calm command tone. "And prep the isolation wing. Agent Cross just brought us something that isn't the flu." She turned to the monitor, her eyes hardening as she saw the news ticker scrolling across the bottom of the screen. A breaking news alert. Unexplained illness reported at International Airport. Grace pulled a pair of gloves from the box, snapping them onto her scarred hands with a sharp thwack. She looked at Cross, then at her team. "Lock it down," she ordered. "The war just came to us." Grace Valdez was abandoned in the desert by a commander who didn't care enough to look back. Don't be like Colonel Vance. Don't just watch this story and leave me here in the algorithmic desert alone. Subscribe and hit like to call in the extraction team. Or, you can just scroll away and leave me behind. Your choice.